Mrs. Pemberton, these animals are worth approximately $2 million each, and they're protected under the Endangered Species Act as part of a genetic preservation initiative. The unmarked vehicles you reported were federal veterinarians conducting mandatory health assessments. The room seemed to spin around Karen. She'd always assumed Hartwell was just a stubborn old farmer sitting on valuable land. The possibility that his cattle were worth more than her entire subdivision had never occurred to her. Furthermore, Agent Torres continued, filing false reports about federal conservation programs is a serious offense. It wastes taxpayer resources and endangers critical preservation efforts. Karen's voice came out as a whisper. What are the penalties for something like that? Up to 5 years in federal prison and substantial fines. Torres replied matter-of-factly. But Mr. Hartwell has asked us to be lenient, given that this appears to be a misunderstanding rather than malicious interference. After the agent left, Karen sat alone in her living room, staring at the photographs of the cattle she'd dismissed as worthless farm animals. Her husband would be furious when he found out. Her position as HOA president would be in jeopardy if word got out about the federal investigation. And worst of all, Jake Hartwell now held all the cards. Her phone rang, and she saw Hartwell's name on the caller ID, a number she'd never seen before, but somehow knew belonged to him. Mrs. Pemberton, his gravelly voice was calm but firm. I think it's time we had a conversation, face to face. Karen's hands trembled as she held the phone. Mr. Hartwell, I can explain. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, my front gate, come alone. The line went dead, leaving Karen to contemplate the wreckage of her carefully planned attack. She'd underestimated her opponent, and now she was about to face the consequences. Karen barely slept that night, her mind racing through possible scenarios for her meeting with Jake Hartwell. She dressed carefully, not too formal, not too casual, hoping to strike a balance between authority and humility. As she drove toward his ranch, her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Jake was waiting at the gate when she arrived, leaning against a weathered fence post with his arms crossed. Up close, he looked older than she'd expected, probably in his 70s, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Behind him, she could see some of the massive white cattle grazing peacefully in the morning sun. Mrs. Pemberton, he said, opening the gate, appreciate you coming. We need to clear the air. Karen followed him along a dirt path toward a modest farmhouse, her designer heels struggling with the uneven ground. Mr. Hartwell, I want to apologize for any misunderstanding. He held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Let's sit on the porch first. I want to show you something. They settled into wooden rocking chairs that had clearly seen decades of use. Jake pulled out a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. These cattle, he began, pointing to recent photos of his herd, aren't just rare livestock. They're descendants of animals that were nearly extinct after World War II. My grandfather brought the first breeding pair to America in 1952, and our family has been part of the federal conservation program ever since. Karen studied the photos, seeing the animals with new eyes. They were magnificent creatures, much larger than typical cattle, with distinctive features she'd never noticed before. The federal government pays us to maintain genetic diversity, Jake continued. Every calf born here is tracked, tested, and registered. The hunters you saw, they were actually federal agents conducting a security assessment after someone reported suspicious activity. The weight of her mistake settled heavily on Karen's shoulders. Mr. Hartwell, I had no idea. I assumed. You assumed I was just an old farmer standing in the way of progress. He finished for her. I get that a lot. But this ranch isn't going anywhere, Mrs. Pemberton. It can't. We're bound by federal contract for the next 30 years minimum. Karen felt her carefully constructed world crumbling. All her plans for forcing him to sell, all her complaints and schemes, they'd been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what she was dealing with. However, Jake said, his tone shifting slightly, I'm not unreasonable. You've been harassing me for 3 years, filing false complaints, trying to interfere with my business. That stops now. Of course, Karen said quickly. Absolutely. No more complaints, no more interference. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. I talked to Agent Torres yesterday. She's prepared to file federal charges against you for filing false reports and wasting government resources. But I convinced her to hold off on one condition. Karen's heart pounded. What condition? You're going to help me, Jake said simply. Your HOA has been nothing but trouble for this ranch, spreading rumors, questioning our operations, making my life difficult. But you've also got influence in the community, connections I don't have. Karen frowned, not understanding where this was heading. The conservation program is expanding, Jake explained. The feds want to establish 2 more breeding facilities in this county. They're looking for suitable properties, but they need community support, zoning approvals, that sort of thing. The implication hit Karen like a thunderbolt. You want me to help them find locations? 3 days later, Karen sat in her home office, surrounded by manila folders and printed photographs. Rick Morrison had delivered his preliminary report that morning, and what she discovered made her hands shake with excitement. The cattle on Hartwell's ranch weren't ordinary livestock. They were registered breeding stock worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But more importantly, Rick had uncovered something that made Karen's pulse quicken: irregularities in the ranch's federal inspection records. Mrs. Pemberton, Rick had explained during their meeting, these aren't just expensive cattle. According to the USDA database, they're part of some kind of conservation program. But here's the interesting part: the inspection schedules have been inconsistent, and there are gaps in the documentation going back 18 months. Karen had immediately seen the opportunity. If Hartwell was failing to maintain proper federal compliance, she might finally have the leverage she needed. She'd spent the rest of the morning researching agricultural regulations and had found her golden ticket. Improper maintenance of federally monitored livestock was a violation that could result in immediate seizure of animals and substantial fines. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Susan Chen. "So you talking to that PI again? Please tell me you're not going after Jake Hartwell. My husband works with federal agriculture inspectors, and he says to leave that ranch alone." Karen deleted the message without responding. Susan had always been weak-willed, too concerned with keeping the peace to understand what real leadership required. As HOA president, Karen had a responsibility to protect property values, and Hartwell's ranch was a constant threat to their community's prestige. That evening, Karen made her move. She called the USDA's fraud hotline and filed a detailed complaint about suspected violations at the Hartwell ranch. She carefully avoided mentioning her personal conflict with the rancher, instead presenting herself as a concerned citizen who'd noticed suspicious activity. "I've observed unmarked vehicles coming and going at odd hours," she told the intake specialist, "and there have been unexplained sounds, machinery running late at night, which seems inconsistent with normal ranching operations." The lies came easily. Karen had perfected the art of spinning minor infractions into major violations during her years as HOA president. She'd used similar tactics to force out 3 homeowners who dared to challenge her authority. 2 days later, a convoy of federal vehicles pulled up to Hartwell's gate. Karen watched through her binoculars from her bedroom window as uniformed agents met with the old rancher. She could see him gesturing animatedly, clearly agitated by their presence. After an hour, the agents began walking through his pastures, taking photographs and consulting clipboards. Karen felt a surge of triumph. Finally, she'd found a way to bring down the stubborn old man who'd been thumbing his nose at progress for too long. But her celebration was short-lived. That afternoon, FBI agent Rebecca Torres knocked on Karen's front door. "Mrs. Pemberton, I need to speak with you about a complaint you filed regarding the Hartwell ranch." Karen's mouth went dry, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, Agent Torres. I'm always happy to cooperate with federal law enforcement. Please come in." They sat in Karen's pristine living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and carefully arranged family photos. Agent Torres opened a thick folder and placed several photographs on the coffee table. "These are American Chianina cattle," Torres explained, pointing to images of the large white animals Karen had seen grazing in Hartwell's pastures. "They're part of a federal conservation program designed to preserve rare livestock breeds. Mr. Hartwell's ranch houses one of only 3 breeding populations in North America. Karen's confidence began to waver. I didn't realize they were anything special. They look like regular cattle to me. Ma'am, I'm looking at the paperwork right now. Mr. Hartwell is standing here with me, and he's got all the documentation. You might want to double-check your facts before filing complaints. The line went dead, leaving Karen staring at her phone in fury. Through the fence, she could see the deputy talking to a weathered man in worn jeans and a cowboy hat, Jake Hartwell himself. Even from a distance, she could tell he was gesturing in her direction, probably telling the officer about her years of harassment. But as Karen watched, something strange happened. The deputy's demeanor changed completely. He straightened up, removed his hat, and began speaking to Hartwell with obvious deference. Whatever the old rancher was telling him seemed to carry serious weight. Karen squinted through her binoculars, trying to read lips, but she was too far away. All she could see was the deputy nodding repeatedly and taking notes in his pad. Then Hartwell pointed toward a distant pasture where Karen could just make out the shakes of cattle grazing. The deputy got back in his patrol car and drove off, but not before stopping beside Karen's vehicle. He rolled down his window with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Pemberton, I strongly advise you to cease any interference with Mr. Hartwell's property. What he's got on that ranch, well, let's just say it's protected by laws you don't want to mess with." Before Karen could respond, he drove away, leaving her with more questions than answers. Protected by what laws? What was so special about a bunch of cattle and some hunters with permits? As she sat in her car, watching Jake Hartwell disappear back into his property, Karen made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't backing down. If anything, the deputy's cryptic warning only convinced her that Hartwell was hiding something worth investigating. She pulled out her phone and opened her contacts, scrolling to a number she hadn't called in months. Rick Morrison, the private investigator she'd hired during her messy divorce. If there were secrets on that ranch, she was going to uncover them. "More than that," Jake said. "I want you to become an advocate for the program. Use your position as HOA president to educate people about what we're doing here. Help smooth the way for the expansion." Karen's mind raced. This could actually work in her favor. If she became known as someone who supported important federal conservation efforts, it might rehabilitate her reputation after the investigation. But it would also mean abandoning her plans to force Hartwell out. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Jake's expression hardened. "Then Agent Torres files those charges, and you explain to your neighbors why federal agents are arresting their HOA president. Your choice." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the decision settling between them. Finally, Karen spoke. "If I agree to help, what exactly would that involve?" "Public support," Jake said. "Help us get zoning variances for the new facilities. Use your connections to smooth over any community concerns. And most importantly, stop treating this ranch like it's your enemy." Karen looked out over the pastures, watching the valuable cattle that she'd dismissed as common farm animals. She thought about her husband's reaction when he found out about the federal investigation, about the whispers that would follow her through the subdivision if word got out. "All right," she said finally, "I'll help you. But I need something in return." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, Mrs. Pemberton." "Not demands," Karen clarified. "A partnership. If I'm going to advocate for this program, I need to understand it completely. I want access to the ranch, regular briefings on the conservation work, maybe even a role in the expansion planning." For the first time since she'd arrived, Jake smiled. "You don't give up easy, do you? Would you respect me if I did?" Jake considered this, then extended his weathered hand. "Partners, then. But understand, Mrs. Pemberton, this ranch comes first. Always." As Karen shook his hand, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine respect for an opponent who'd outmaneuvered her completely. But she also felt something else, a new kind of opportunity. If the conservation program was as important as Jake claimed, there might be federal grants involved, publicity opportunities, maybe even a way to transform her reputation from neighborhood busybody to conservation advocate. "There's one more thing," Jake said as they walked back toward the gate. The program expansion isn't the only thing happening here. We're also being considered for a research partnership with the state university. If that goes through, there could be students, professors, maybe even international visitors coming to study our operation. Karen's mind immediately began calculating the possibilities. Increased traffic to the area, potential for tourism, maybe even academic conferences. Her subdivision could become known as the neighborhood adjacent to an important research facility. "When do we start?" she asked. Jake opened the gate for her, his smile widening. "Mrs. Pemberton, I have a feeling we started the minute you decided to mess with my bulls." As Karen drove home, her phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "Coming home early from tournament. Hope you stayed out of trouble." She looked in her rearview mirror at Jake's ranch, where million-dollar cattle grazed peacefully under federal protection, and smiled. Trouble, it seemed, was just the beginning of something much more interesting. But as she pulled into her driveway, Karen noticed a black sedan parked across the street, the same type of vehicle Agent Torres had driven. Through her rearview mirror, she could see someone in the driver's seat taking photographs of her house. The conservation program, she realized, might be more complicated than Jake had let on, and her involvement was far from over. Karen Pemberton stood on her perfectly manicured front lawn, clipboard in hand, watching smoke curl up from her neighbor's property through her designer binoculars. The acrid smell of a barbecue pit mixed with something else, something that made her nose wrinkle in disgust. She'd been the Willowbrook Estates HOA president for 3 years, and in that time, she'd transformed their upscale community into a pristine showcase of suburban perfection. But the 200-acre ranch that bordered their development had become her personal nemesis. "That's it," she muttered, adjusting her pearl necklace with one hand, while speed dialing with the other. "Margaret, it's Karen." "Yes, I know it's Sunday, but this is an emergency. The Hartwell Ranch is violating noise ordinances again, and I swear I can smell manure from my kitchen window." The truth was, Karen had been plotting against old Jake Hartwell's ranch since the day she moved in. His property predated their development by decades, but that didn't stop her from filing complaint after complaint with the county. Noise violations for his roosters, odor complaints about his cattle, even a frivolous lawsuit claiming his fence was 2 inches over the property line, which had cost her $5,000 when it was proven wrong. But today felt different. Today, she'd spotted something through her binoculars that made her blood boil. Hunters. 3 men in camouflage gear walking across Hartwell's pasture with rifles slung over their shoulders, heading toward a grove of oak trees where she'd seen deer grazing. Karen's phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "At golf tournament all day. Don't do anything crazy while I'm gone." Too late for that, she thought, already formulating her plan. She marched back inside and pulled up the county hunting regulations on her laptop. Her eyes gleamed as she found exactly what she was looking for. Hunting was prohibited within 500 feet of residential properties without proper permits and neighbor notification. Those hunters were definitely within 500 feet of the Pemberton residence. 20 minutes later, Karen was parked on the shoulder of the county road, watching the hunters through the fence. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report armed trespassers on private property," she said in her most authoritative voice. "They're hunting illegally near residential homes with children present." The dispatcher sounded skeptical. "Ma'am, do you know for certain they don't have permission to be there?" "I'm the HOA president of Willowbrook Estates," Karen replied, as if that title carried the weight of law enforcement. "I monitor all activities that affect our community's safety. These men are clearly poaching." After hanging up, Karen felt a surge of vindication. She'd been trying for years to find a way to force Jake Hartwell to sell his ranch to developers. The old man was sitting on a gold mine, prime real estate that could house 3 more subdivisions like theirs. But he'd stubbornly refused every offer, claiming his family had worked that land for 4 generations. Well, if she could prove he was allowing illegal hunting, the county might finally take action, maybe even revoke whatever agricultural exemptions kept his property taxes so low. Then he'd have no choice but to sell. Her phone rang, Deputy Martinez from the sheriff's department. Mrs. Pemberton, we've responded to your call. The hunters you reported have valid permits and written permission from the landowner. Everything appears to be in order. Karen's grip tightened on the phone. That's impossible. I'm certain they don't have proper authorization.